Kinshade Stories community, I'm glad you're here because what happened in my office this week shook me in a way I wasn't prepared for. He walked in on a Tuesday afternoon, and I remember thinking he looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks, not days, weeks. He sat down, folded his hands on his knees the way people do when they're trying to hold themselves together, and then he said something that stopped the room cold. He said his mother had called him the night before, and during that call, she told him that the man who raised him, the man who walked him down the aisle at his own wedding 20 years ago as his best man, the man whose name was on every birthday card, every graduation photo, every family Christmas picture going back to 1987, that man had never existed, not the way Darnell thought. The person he had been calling his father since he was 4 years old had, in fact, spent the last 37 years living under a name that wasn't his. And the reason his mother was telling him now, at 11:45 p.m. on a random Monday in October, was because that man had just been arrested, and the charges were not small. Darnell looked at me across the desk, and he said, "I don't know who I am anymore." He wasn't being dramatic, he meant it literally. Before I go any further, I want to say something important. Every story I share here comes from real therapeutic work, but names, locations, and identifying details are always changed to protect the people involved. What happens in that office stays protected. I share these stories because I believe they help people who are sitting at home right now feeling alone in something they don't have words for. But please understand, every situation is different. Nothing I say here should replace working with a professional who knows your specific circumstances. If something in this story resonates with you, take that seriously. Reach out to someone qualified. What I offer here is perspective, not prescription. Darnell was 43 years old. He lived in Knoxville, Tennessee, where he had built a quiet, steady life. He worked in commercial real estate, had his own small firm, nothing flashy but solid. He was married, 15 years, to a woman named Rochelle. They had 2 kids, 12 and 9. From the outside, his life looked like exactly what it was supposed to look like at 43. He told me in our first session that he had never been in therapy before. He came because Rochelle had basically told him he had to. She said she could see something happening to him after the phone call, something she didn't recognize, and she was scared. I asked him what she meant by that. He said, "She told me I went quiet, like a light went out." He had come to me 3 days after his mother's call. I asked him to walk me through what she told him as slowly as he could. He said he'd rather do it fast. I let him. His father's name, the name he'd known his whole life, was Raymond Earl Tillman. Raymond had come into Darnell's life when Darnell was 4, married his mother when Darnell was 6, and adopted him legally at age 7. Raymond worked for 30 years in logistics management. He coached Little League for 9 seasons. He drove Darnell to every single college visit. He cried at Darnell's wedding, real tears. He had the photos. He'd looked at them 3 times since the phone call. He kept trying to find something wrong in Raymond's face. He couldn't. What his mother told him on that Monday night was this: Raymond Earl Tillman was not Raymond Earl Tillman. The real Raymond Tillman had died in 1981, at age 19, in a car accident in rural Georgia. The man who married Darnell's mother had taken that name, taken the identity sometime around 1983. He had built a life on a dead man's social security number, a reconstructed paper trail, and 37 years of careful, consistent behavior. His real name, as far as law enforcement had been able to determine, was Gerald Wayne Pruitt. And Gerald Wayne Pruitt had outstanding warrants in 2 states going back to 1982. Fraud charges, identity-related crimes, 1 count of felony theft from a business dispute that had never been resolved. He had never hurt anyone physically. He had never been violent, but he'd walked into Darnell's family's life wearing a dead man's name and stayed there for almost 40 decades. His mother had known for 2 years. That was the moment Darnell's voice changed in my office. Up until then, he'd been controlled, flat. He was reporting facts. But when he got to that part, that his mother had known for 2 years and said nothing, he stopped. He put both hands flat on his thighs. He looked at the wall behind me. He said, "She found out when she was going through some of his papers. She said she didn't know what to do. She said she didn't want to blow up the family." I asked him how he felt about that. He said, I don't feel anything right now. That's what worries me. He came back the following week, then the week after that, and over those sessions, the story got more complicated in ways I hadn't expected. He started talking about specific memories, not trauma, memories that he'd always considered good. Raymond teaching him to drive, Raymond at his college graduation, Raymond sitting across from him at a diner the year his business almost failed, pushing an envelope across the table with $18,000, cash. He'd always assumed it was Raymond's savings. He'd paid it back over 2 years. Raymond had never mentioned it again. Was any of it real? He asked me in our third session. Or was I just a prop, something that made the cover story look better? That question, that is the question that sits at the center of this kind of wound. His relationship with Rochelle was straining, not because she was doing anything wrong. She was steady, patient, present, but Darnell couldn't sleep next to her without lying awake, going through his entire life, reprocessing every memory with the new information. He told me, I keep thinking about every time he said he was proud of me, and now I don't know what that even means. I don't know if he meant it. I don't know if a person like that can mean anything. I asked him what he knew about who Raymond, who Gerald, had actually been before 1983. He didn't know much. He'd tried to look it up online. He'd found a small mention in an old Georgia newspaper archive. Gerald Wayne Pruitt had grown up in difficult circumstances. Father was not in the picture. Mother had struggled. He'd been in trouble young. The fraud charges stemmed from a business he'd tried to start at 19 that went badly wrong. He'd run rather than face the consequences. I asked Darnell, what do you think he was running from, beyond the legal charges? Darnell didn't answer right away. He looked out the window. He said, himself, probably. We sat with that for a while. Then he told me something that changed the entire shape of what I understood about this case. He said that 2 days before coming to see me that week, he had driven to the county jail where Raymond, Gerald, was being held. He had not planned to go in. He sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes. Then he went in. He requested a visit, and Raymond, Gerald, agreed to see him. I asked what happened. Darnell took a long breath. He said, he looked the same. That's the first thing I thought. He looked exactly the same as he always did. Old, but the same. Raymond had looked at him across the partition. No pleading, no breaking down. He just said, I know why you're here. And Darnell said, do you love me? Did you ever love me? He told me he hadn't planned to ask that. It came out before he could stop it. And Raymond, this man, this stranger, this person Darnell still did not have a name for in his own mind, looked at him and said, you were the only real thing I ever had. Everything else was survival. You were not survival. You were my son. That was real. That's the only real thing I'm sure of. Darnell told me he left without saying anything else. He sat in his car for 20 minutes, then he drove home. He said, I don't know what to do with that. I said, you don't have to do anything with it yet. Here is where it gets even more layered. The following week, Darnell came in and told me he had gotten a call from a lawyer, not Raymond's lawyer, a different one, a woman representing the estate of the real Raymond Earl Tillman's surviving family. The original Raymond had had a sister. She was still alive. She was in her late 60s. She had just found out, after all these years, that someone had been using her brother's name. She was not interested in pursuing any civil action against Darnell's family. What she wanted, and this is what hit me hard when Darnell told me, was a phone call with Darnell, because she said she wanted to hear what kind of man had carried her brother's name through the world, whether the name had been treated well. Darnell looked at me and said, how do I answer that? How do I tell a woman that a man she never knew used her dead brother's name to become someone I'm proud of? Because I am. I'm still proud of him, and I hate that I'm still proud of him, and I don't know what that makes me. I told him it made him human. As his psychologist, the work we've been doing together is rooted in something called identity disruption, which is exactly what it sounds like. When the foundation story of who you are is removed or significantly altered, the psychological impact is not just emotional, it's structural. Darnell grew up with a narrative. My father is Raymond Tillman. Raymond Tillman is a good man. I come from that. That narrative informed how he saw himself, how he made decisions, how he built his own identity as a father and a husband. When the narrative collapsed, it didn't just make him sad, it created a kind of vertigo. Not knowing who you are is not a metaphor. It is a real psychological state, and it can be destabilizing in very practical ways: disrupted sleep, difficulty concentrating, emotional numbness, disconnection from people who love you. I explained to Darnell that what he was experiencing was a form of complicated grief. Not just grief for the loss of Raymond as he understood him, but grief for the version of himself that had existed before the phone call. That Darnell, the one with an intact story, was gone. And that kind of grief doesn't follow a straight path. We talked about something called narrative identity, the idea, well supported in psychological research, that human beings construct their sense of self through story. We are the stories we tell about where we came from, what shaped us, what we survived, what we chose. When a central chapter of that story turns out to have been built on a lie, the entire structure shakes. But, and this is what I worked hard to help Darnell understand, the story doesn't disappear. It gets complicated. It becomes harder to tell. But Darnell's childhood still happened. Raymond's hands still steadied the bicycle. That money still came across the diner table. Those facts did not evaporate. The name on them changed. The person underneath the name turned out to be more complex and more broken than Darnell had known. But the acts themselves, those were real. Whether they count, and how much, and what they mean going forward, that is work only Darnell can do. I cannot do it for him. Together, we looked at the question of forgiveness. And I was careful here, because forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood concepts I encounter in clinical work. I reminded Darnell that forgiveness, when and if it comes, is not a statement that what happened was acceptable. It is not a gift to the other person. It is a decision about what you are going to carry. I told him there is no timeline. There is no correct answer. His mother's choice to stay silent for 2 years was a separate wound that needed its own attention. His wife's steadiness was a resource he needed to let himself use. His children, they didn't need to know everything right now. That was a separate conversation for a later time, when Darnell himself had more solid ground to stand on. We also talked about what I want to call the paradox of inherited identity. Darnell had spent 43 years being shaped in part by a man who was not who he said he was. And yet, the values Raymond passed on, the work ethic, the emotional steadiness, the willingness to show up, Darnell had internalized those. They were his now. No arrest, no revelation, no legal proceeding could reach back into Darnell and pull those things out of him. I reminded him of that directly. I said, what he gave you, you own. You built something real with materials that came from a complicated place. That doesn't make what you built less real. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, my daughter looks like him, around the eyes. He paused. I don't know what to do with that either. I told him, not yet. You don't have to know yet. That's where we are right now. He's still coming in. We're still doing the work. I think about this case during the week. That almost never happens to me anymore, not after 25 years. But this one does, because the question Darnell is sitting with is one that I think touches something universal, even if most of us will never face it in this exact form. The question is, if the person who shaped you was not who you thought they were, does what they gave you still belong to you? Does love that was built on a false foundation count? And if someone spent their whole life being one kind of person to you, even while hiding something enormous, what do you call that? I don't have a clean answer. I don't think there is one.
What I do know is that Darnell is one of the most honest people I have sat across from in a long time, and the fact that he drove to that jail and asked that question, that tells me everything about who he is. Whoever raised him, whatever name that man used, something in that raising produced a person who, even in the middle of the worst shock of his life, needed to know if the love was real. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. If this story moved you, I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever had a moment where someone you deeply trusted turned out to be someone you didn't fully know? Not necessarily this dramatic, but a version of that. A moment where the story you had about a person changed, and you had to decide what to do with everything that came before it. I genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. Those conversations matter here. If this reached you today, please leave a like. It helps more people find this community when they need it most. And if you're not yet subscribed to Kinshade Stories, please do that now. We put a lot of care into every story we share here, and there's much more to come. Take care of yourselves this week, and I'll see you in the next one.